Welcome, everyone from Canada, the United States, China, and other countries and regions to our webinar on the implications of Biden's climate policy on Canada and China. My name is Jia Wang. I'm the Interim Director of the China Institute at the University of Alberta. This event is jointly organized by the China Institute in Edmonton and the Institute for China-America Studies in Washington, D.C. Please allow me to briefly introduce our two institutes. The China Institute is the only independent China-focused policy think tank and research center in Canada. We generate and disseminate fact-based knowledge that supports in-depth understanding of today's China and encourages policy development in response to China's evolving role in the world, especially in the diplomatic, economic, and security domains, and those most relevant to Canada. The Institute for China-America Studies, or ICAS, is an independent think tank focusing on the evolving dynamics in the U.S.-China relationship. ICAS promotes greater collaboration and mutual understanding through exchange of ideas, objective policy-oriented research, and fair assessments of this critical bilateral relations. Our two institutes have worked together on many events, research collaboration, and we look forward to much more in the future. Our event today will start by short presentations by four distinguished panelists providing the US, Canadian, and Chinese perspectives, and is followed by moderated discussion and Q&A. We encourage our audience members to submit your questions using the Zoom Q&A function. We have over 200 registrants, and we'll try to accommodate as many questions as possible. This event will be recorded, and the recording will be made available to you shortly. Now it's my honor and great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Dr. Nong Hong. She's a friend and also a colleague for the past 10 years. Dr. Hong is the Executive Director of the Institute for China-America Studies and a Senior Fellow at the China Institute. Her research takes an interdisciplinary approach to examining international relations and international law with focus on ocean governance in East Asia and the Arctic, law of the sea, international security, and dispute settlement and conflict resolution. She has numerous publications under her belt, and her most recent book, China's Role in the Arctic, was published just last year. Nong, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jia, for a very kind introduction, and good morning, everyone. And as Jia mentioned, we have four speakers for today's webinar. I'm not going to read through their bio as Jia did for me, but I'm going to introduce, we have Ms. Sally Yozell. She's the Director of the Environmental Security Program at the Stimson Center based in Washington, D.C. And we also have Professor Kevin Tu, who's a Adjunct Professor at the School of Environment of Beijing Normal University. He is also formerly the China Program Manager at the International Energy Agency. And then we have Dr. Jennifer Winter. She's the Director of the Energy and Environmental Policy Research Division at the School of Public Policy, University of Calgary in Canada. And our last speaker, Mr. Ranping Song, he is the Developing Country Climate Action Manager at the World Resources Institute based in Washington, D.C. The US President Biden began taking executive action immediately following his inauguration to enact many of his administration's initial priorities, including issuing 2 executive orders on climate change and environment. And both President Biden and Mr. John Kerry, the special presidential envoy for climate, made their keynote remark on climate change at the Munich Security Conference on February 19, which highlights the U.S. climate change policy. So Sally, could you share with us what this policy means for the U.S., for its foreign policy, and whether there are any divergent views domestically? Sally, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Nong Hong and Jia Wang, for the introduction, and thank you to the ICAS and China Institute for hosting today's very important discussion. So Dr. Hong asked me to provide an overview of the Biden administration's climate change policy and highlight some of its implications for China, Canada, and the wider international community. So, as Nong just described, after 4 years of the US being absent on climate change, the Biden administration has brought America back, driving a climate agenda with an which is unparalleled in US history. And it's not a moment too soon. 2020 was a year of record-setting climate events, from destructive wildfires and heat to an unusually active hurricane and typhoon season. And the recent flooding in India caused by the melting Himalayan glacier really underscores the direct threat posed by climate change to communities, their economies, and the environment. So the Biden climate plan is ambitious, beginning with, as Nong pointed out, the early appointment of John Kerry as the special presidential envoy for climate, my old boss, and also Gina McCarthy as the national domestic advisor to the president. Two globally known powerhouses are going to marshal an all of government approach. Gina McCarthy is already pushing science-based information on climate change to move every federal agency to act, to adapt, and to innovate. While John Kerry is using his international relationships to build a global coalition to meet the climate emergency head on, followed by bold action. In fact, just 2 days ago, Envoy Kerry said, and I quote, US climate commitments will be aggressive, achievable, and real. And he noted that we're really going to see the greatest economic transformation since the Industrial Revolution. So these two political heavyweights are really going to bring together every federal agency in the US government. And every new cabinet in the Biden administration has a climate portfolio, whether it's the Treasury Department, our Homeland Security, Housing, Commerce, Transportation, and even the Defense Department, just to name a few. And as Nong said, the president signed a major executive order in January, which outlined how his new team will really tackle the climate crisis at home, abroad, create jobs all across renewable energy sector, climate-proof our US infrastructure, and really start to restore scientific integrity throughout the government. The president pledged to achieve a net zero carbon emission economy by 2050. Other key policies he's announced include decarbonizing the US electricity sector by 2035 through wind, solar, and nuclear, advancing technologies and innovation for batteries, creating the necessary national green energy infrastructure while increasing high-speed rail. The administration plans to replace the US government automobile fleet with electric vehicles, and that's over 645,000 vehicles. Also installed 500,000 new electric vehicle charging stations all across the country, provide tax credits and incentives for consumers as they shift to the electric vehicles, while also supporting the auto industry as it transitions. They plan to create a civilian climate corps, promote smart decarbonized agriculture, invest in environmental justice communities. The administration also paused new oil and gas leases on federal lands and waters, and as you know, canceled the Keystone Pipeline. And at the international level, the US has rejoined the Paris Climate Agreement and is scheduled to host a climate summit in April 22nd on Earth. So hopefully leaders from both Canada and China will attend. During the year of COVID, carbon emissions has declined by 10% across the US, and the Biden administration seeks to continue to lower the emissions further, grow the economy at the same time. And there are positive signs and good momentum on how to achieve this. In the US, for example, today, renewable energy is cheaper to produce than fossil fuels. In 2020, renewable energy made up about 20% of the electric sector, compared to 20% in coal, 20% in oil, and 40% in natural gas. And it is expanding every day. Climate action is starting to be a moneymaker in the US, creating good paying jobs across solar, wind, and nuclear. Major US automobile manufacturers have signed up to reach the goal of all electric vehicles by 2035. And just 2 days ago, Volvo joined other major automakers like Ford, agreeing to make its entire car line fully electric by 2030. And this is really important to the US because transportation is the largest carbon polluter, making up about 28%. And there are also other efforts to expand biofuels and create carbon capture markets. The COVID relief legislation currently before Congress is President Biden's #1 priority. After it passes, the administration will shift to their next major Biden legislative initiative, which is likely to be a bold green energy and infrastructure plan. It'll prioritize the renewable energy generation, build and upgrade needed energy and infrastructure, including our national energy grid system, build sustainable housing, expand automobile charging stations, and really increase the research and development that's needed to improve batteries. So responding to the climate change also entails a strategic cooperation with U.S. international partners and allies. Over the past 12 months, we've seen action from many important international players. China recently brought back veteran Xi Jinping as special climate envoy, a welcome compliment to John Kerry. And last September, President Xi announced China's ambitious goals of peaking carbon emissions by 2030 and reaching carbon neutrality by 2060. China has opened a national carbon market as of February 1st. And my understanding is the 14th five-year plan, which is expected to be released any day now, will probably include environmental sustainability, air quality, carbon emission reductions, and ocean protection. And Canada has a long-standing policy of net zero carbon emissions by 2050. And just last week, President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau announced the creation of a high-level ministerial partnership between John Kerry and Canada's Environment Minister Wilkinson. This partnership will really seek to align both countries' policies as they strive to achieve that net zero emissions by 2050 together. As the world begins to emerge from COVID, many countries are attempting to harness new technologies and take action to build back better to get their economies moving again. It is critical that we harness this short-term ambition into long-term solutions for COP26. We cannot go back to where we were pre-pandemic. And last week, the UN released its initial National Determined Contribution Synthesis Report. And the NDC report showed that nations must redouble efforts and submit stronger, more ambitious national climate action plans for COP26. The radical change in energy and climate policies will have profound geopolitical implications. As countries start to release details and enact policies to meet their ambitious climate pledges, there are three areas I think we should all keep an eye on in the US and globally. First, the transition to a clean, renewable energy economy. Historically, carbon-based fuels have powered America. Biden's climate policies are designed to take us to a clean, renewable energy economy with long-term skilled jobs. And this is transformational for our economy. Many economists suggest that as the US moves away from fossil fuels to renewables, there is a direct one-for-one trade-off in jobs. For every job lost in the fossil fuels, one will be added in the renewable energy sector. And that ratio is only expected to improve. As investments in renewable energy continue to increase, we should see a positive race around the world to meet net zero carbon goals. Second, there is a need to really ensure that bilateral assistance and overseas development spending is targeting green infrastructure and green energy development. The U.S., Canada, and China all invest significant development funds overseas. Too often, investment continues to support the expansion of the use of fossil fuels. President Biden has called for a climate finance plan to assist developing countries in implementing ambitious emissions reduction measures, protect critical ecosystems, build resilience against the impacts of climate change. And he's tasked USAID, Treasury, and state to make this happen. As governments pledge to reduce carbon at home to meet the Paris Agreement, those same governments should account for carbon increases that result from their foreign investments overseas. And then third, the importance of transparency cannot be overstated. While pledges and commitments are welcome steps, they should be backed up by meaningful action and transparency on how they will meet their climate goals. As countries submit their NDCs in the run-up to the COP26 in November, transparency will be critical to track the measure of progress. So to close, as the impacts of climate change emergency become ever starker, there is real momentum and a sense of urgency behind the push for climate action, both in the U.S., Canada, and China, as well as throughout the international community. The key to countering climate change will be harnessing political will, showing leadership while navigating sensitive international issues and achieving meaningful agreements. Our three countries face a lot of intransigent and difficult issues with each other, but addressing climate change is one with a common purpose and common enemy. John Kerry recently suggested that the U.S. would be able to set aside differences and compartmentalize climate issues to work with China to achieve mutual success. So again, in closing, now is a moment in time with an opportunity for leadership, cooperation, action, and investment. Thank you, and I look forward to hearing questions soon.
Thank you so much, Sally. That's a very comprehensive, and we heard a lot of like policy, actions, legislation, and I think by mentioning, emphasizing the important role of the U.S. working with international partners and allies, will leading us very perfectly to our next three speakers. So the U.S.-China climate relations, and it's well known that during the Obama administration was central to the global process leading to the Paris Climate Agreement. However, the deterioration of the bilateral relations during the Trump administration has complicated the capacity of both sides to work together on the climate change. And Professor Tu, we would like to hear from you. What do you think will be the potential impact of Biden climate policy on China in terms of its energy, environmental, climate policy? Professor Tu?
No, thank you very much for the invite. It's a great pleasure for me to join this exciting discussion. To understand the prospects of U.S.-China collaboration in the post-Trump era, it's necessary to look at three contradictions. The first contradiction is the different position between the U.S. and China on climate collaborations relations with overall bilateral relations. For instance, on January 27th, U.S. climate envoy John Kerry stated that climate collaboration was a critical standalone issue that will never lead to a weaker China policy. By contrast, the Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian stressed that China-US cooperation in specific areas, unlike flowers that can bloom in a greenhouse despite winter chill, is closely linked with bilateral relationship as a whole. The second one is the contradiction of China's phased climate commitment, because the international community is very excited about China's long-term climate pledge to peak carbon, to achieve carbon neutrality before 2060, but there is lots of concern about China will only peak national emissions before 2030. The third one actually is the priority of climate change in China compared with in OECD countries, because in China, currently in the energy and the environmental fields, climate change not as a pricing issue as energy security and air pollution. So we should first understand these three contradictions. Then we may do a very simplified SWOT analysis to look at the strengths, the weakness, opportunity, and threats surrounding U.S.-China climate cooperation. First, let's look at the strengths of the U.S.-China climate diplomacy. So, at the Chinese side, I personally believe the surprising climate pledge made by President Xi Jinping in last September is a very proactive defensive move that actually has laid down the foundation for U.S.-China climate cooperation, because although it's quite ambitious, in the longer term, there's still some flexibility in the short term. For instance, it's entirely possible for China to peak its national carbon emissions in next 5 years instead of 10 years. And also, the current climate pledge has left out the Belt and Road Initiative, especially energy investment. So if the United States is interested, there's still plenty of room for negotiation. Unlike the strong top-down model in China, in the US side, I think the climate credibility actually rests largely on its robust bottom-up approach, especially at the subnational and the civil society level. Even during the Trump administration, U.S.-China collaboration at a subnational level continued. So we need to be mindful about this fact. Now let's look at the weaknesses of U.S.-China climate cooperation. So after the 4 years Trump presidency, a lack of trust has become the most significant barriers towards cooperation. So how to reduce the trust deficit? This needs a lot of efforts from both sides. In addition, if we look at the political situation in the United States with climate science politicized and public opinion divided, the U.S. federal government's reputation on withholding its international climate commitment has been severely damaged. No matter how climate ambitious the Biden administration may become, the status quo in Washington makes legally binding climate legislation extremely difficult, if not impossible, in Congress. So without extra efforts made by the Biden administration rejoining Paris and announcing a net zero emissions pledge alone do not necessarily make Washington a trustworthy partner from the perspective of decision makers in China. Now let's look at the opportunities. First, I do believe both sides need to ramp up dialogue, a lot of dialogue. One of the easy low-hanging fruits is for Beijing and Washington to restart or renew a number of deals, such as the U.S.-China 10-year framework on energy and environmental, the U.S.-China Climate Working Group, the U.S.-China Clean Energy Research Center. This could be low-hanging fruit. In addition, both Washington and Beijing should further encourage cooperation at the subnational and civil society levels. U.S.-China collaboration is politically more sustainable at the subnational level. And in return, Beijing should relax its overly stringent restriction imposed on foreign environmental NGOs, which could help China to step up international climate cooperation with not only America, but also European Union as well as other parts of the world. Now, let's look at the threats. I do believe in Washington, there's certain danger that China hawks may try to weaponize international climate policy as broad efforts to contain China. Hopefully, that won't be the case. Otherwise, I don't believe the global climate agenda could be moved forward if U.S. is trying to weaponize international climate policy. Last but not least, there might be a lack of self-reflection among decision makers in Beijing about why Sino-US relations have gone so wrong in the past. As the Chinese saying goes, one hand cannot clap, 一个巴掌拍不响. In other words, blaming the Trump administration alone is unlikely to reset bilateral relations in a mutually accepted direction. So if Beijing could instead seriously re-examine its own foreign policy since 2013 through the lens of other countries, especially America, it could be beneficial for China to better understand how to alleviate rising anxiety over its rapid political and economic ascendance in certain parts of the world. I will just stop here and look forward to the Q&A sessions.
Well, thank you so much, Kevin. Both you and Sally use ambitious to describe the individual countries' climate goal. And I think you are very correctly pointing out to the three contradictions, including how to keep the energy security and also keep the environment clean. And there's a long way to go. And thank you for bringing up those recommendations, for instance, to looking at the level of sub-level and also the effort from the civil society. And now I would like to move on to the Canadian perspective. On February 23rd, there is a White House statement titled as a roadmap for a renewed U.S. Canada partnership. So the U.S. President Biden and Canadian Prime Minister Trudeau expressed a commitment to strengthen implementation of the Paris Agreement. And however, Prime Minister Trudeau did also express disappointment on the Keystone Pipeline permit cancellation and talking to the Alberta about a Premier called Biden's cancellation as a gun punch for the U.S.-Canada trade relations. So Jennifer, would you like to share with us what impact that you think Biden's climate policy mean for Canada, for its climate change policy and for the trade issues? Jennifer, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's great to be here, and I'm really looking forward to our discussion later. I want to start my remarks by reminding everyone of sort of the recent history of climate policy development in Canada and the US. And I think it's important to remember that really only recently has there been concerted federal action on climate policy in both countries. In 2016 in Canada with the Pan-Canadian Framework on Clean Growth and Climate Change, and recently with the Biden administration. Before that, it was really action at the subnational level, so provinces and states, and moving towards pricing emissions like the Quebec, California cap and trade system, and British Columbia and Alberta moving forward with emissions pricing. And so I think that's an important context because it sets the stage for the history as well as the future, in that now we have two national governments pushing for action on climate change. In Canada, a Canada-wide carbon price and other actions. And I know that there's a lot of, I would say, like hope on environment, or on the side of environmental advocates in Canada with the new actions by the Biden administration. The challenge, of course, is that right now in Canada, the policy window that allowed for cooperation on emissions pricing and putting in place a Canada-wide price on combustion emissions, that window has passed. And with political change, we have provinces resisting the action at the federal level. And I'm not an expert in Canadian constitutional law, but there is definitely a perception that the federal government has overstepped its authority in several areas, carbon pricing being one of them, environmental impact assessment of infrastructure development being another. And so it creates a wrinkle in future development of policy in Canada, and until the provinces, territories, and federal government can come back to cooperative federalism rather than the situation of somewhat combative federalism we're in right now. In terms of the immediate impacts of the Biden administration's plans for changes in climate policy, one thing I think is really important to note is how integrated North American supply chains are. And so it means simple regulatory changes in the US affect Canada very deeply. And what I mean by this, a push to move to electric vehicles in the US is going to change the availability of electric vehicles in Canada, and that will affect choices by consumers and also push Canadian governments, national and subnational, to make way for the increased availability of electric vehicles, just for example. And I also think it's important, it's not just supply chains, it's infrastructure integration, in that for Canada, our electric grid, we have more connections that are north-south to the United States than east-west. So changes in the US electric grid and generation mix are also going to affect Canada. And again, that's something that subnational policymakers are going to have to react to, as well as policymakers at the federal level in Canada. A key concern in Canada when developing the Pan-Canadian framework and Canada-wide emissions pricing was competitiveness of Canadian industry, and specifically large emitters. And I think that's particularly interesting. I mean, it explicitly recognizes the collective action problem of addressing climate change. And as the US and China and the European Union have increasingly stringent environmental policies, that addresses the competitiveness concerns in terms of, the Canadian industry is going to be competing against jurisdictions that have similarly stringent environmental policies. And so we can expect to see changes in Canadian climate policy in that way. But I think, overarching all of this, because of the integration of North American supply chains, the energy infrastructure, transportation infrastructure, just the overall economy, I think there's going to be a lot of concern and eagerness for policy alignment between Canada and the US. And of course, the tricky part is that we're not just dealing with Canada and the US, we're dealing with 13 provinces and territories and 50 states. And that means that policy alignment is going to be incredibly complicated. But of course, the perfect is the enemy of the good. And I think we should all, really just appreciate that we're not just going to see incremental change going forward, in that there is and will continue to be concerted action. And just the fact that both Canada and the US are aligned on net zero at 2050 is reassuring that the overarching policy goals are aligned, even if the path different provinces and territories and states and countries take to get there is going to be different. And so I think I'll stop here, really looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. When you spoke, I saw Renpei's nodding. I think he pretty much had a lot to share with you when you talk about those, like, for instance, like casting pricing issues. And I think, well, it's a takeaway when we look at the Canadian perspective and you highlight, because the federal authority and the different 13 provinces, the different action, that's something will be a different practice when we try to understand China's climate change policy. So Renping, I think, so when reading from Biden's recent appointees, as Sally mentioned, climate change can be seen as an area we will see more effort from Biden administration, more opportunity for China-US engagement. So what is the prospect for U.S. China or the global cooperation on this climate, environment, security from a traditional perspective? You want to go from there. Renping, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Hong, and thank you for inviting me to give us a chance to talk here today. I'm fortunate enough to be either personally involved in some of the projects or closely observe my colleagues and other organizations to work on the U.S. China cooperation over the years. When I first started to work on China climate energy policy in 2008, that a project on China U.S. cooperation is my first project. So I was trying to give a little bit more personal notes and experience observation to what it looks like when the U.S. China cooperation worked in the past, and hopefully provide a bit more foundation to our understanding what we could look like in the future. So from a very high level, I believe that if we talk about U.S. China cooperation or engagement, that you can roughly distinguish 3 levels, right? You can see the very high level, senior political level, head of state, level engagement and cooperation. You can see that a working level government and to government cooperation, EPA and RDC, Ministry of Environment Protection in China, on those cooperations. And then finally, you see that another level of cooperation and engagement between different think tanks, NGO, research agencies on both sides, and actually in multiple countries that you're trying to foster common understanding engagements. My personal experience, I can tell maybe 3 short period that I personally observed. First is the period that when Bush was the legacy of Bush, and Obama first began his administration, that one of the themes that was hotly debated is so-called measurement, reporting, verification. The context being that there was a lot of mistrust on what emissions really are, whether the action can be verifiable, whether we just talk without action. So we need some kind of scheme and understanding mechanism to truly trust the data going forward. And also, from a practical point of view, that you cannot manage what you can measure. So that's just very practical understanding. If you reach a series of climate change, you're going to do MRV, measurement, reporting, verification. The problem being that it become a very political issues. In the beginning of 2007, 2010, it's a hotly debated international discussion and negotiation in the climate conventions. At one point, when I was working in China, this became a very political sensitive issue that we be very careful not to be not to using this wrong word, otherwise it tap off a lot of political backlash, and then actually create a lot of how to say it's not that helpful at one point to just use that word MRV. But then things actually changed quite a lot as the Obama and Xi's cooperation progress and ramp up. I personally see that a huge decentralization of this issue. So this from a very political heated debate on who controls that, the transparency and data, towards a more technical and normal issue, how you actually tackle the issue. So I began to some a lot more working level corporations, from there's multiple programs that was funded by USA funded programs, and such as the USA Partnership for Climate Actions. There's EPA initiative support on China's MRV efforts. There's also there was a legacy, some Pacific Partnership, Asia Pacific Partnership on Clean Development and Climate, that have some legacy projects on those issues. As a practitioner, I would see that a lot of organizations start to work on those, from developing standards and tools to helping Chinese organizations build a capacity, and then finally to the point that they have developed policy and programs actually come to a point that you're trying to have official policy and program in place, asking corporations to develop its inventories and then have a more or less, it's a lot more robust than when we started on MRV issue. A lot more robust data quality there. I'm not saying that there's no challenge, that's all solved, but then I can attest that there's a lot of progress in the game. Another area I would see that is international climate governance, right? So if you recall a couple of years ago when the conflict was countries are debating and arguing not to do their part, hinging on the common but differentiated responsibility, meaning that developing countries should take in less of burden, and then there's a financing issue, who's going to finance the mitigation actions in developing countries, and how we allocate the sharing. So that's basically a backlog in the international processes. But then as we see that, towards the end of Obama administration, that there's a ramp up within U.S. That was actually the first sign of senior political leadership engagement directly between President Xi and then President Obama, that result in a huge visible progress in terms of U.S. China joint agreement, and then lay the foundation for the negotiation teams, working level folks within both U.S. and China that actually to talk in a more constructive, trustworthy manner. And then it's at that time the press Xie Zhenhua was mentioned by Sally earlier, and then Kerry was the Secretary of State at the time. That and then Todd Stern was the special envoy on climate change in the U.S. That actually started to build the trust that actually have a lot of implication now. On a practitioner level, on international governance, what I can attest is that there's actually a lot of NGOs, including my employer, World Resource Institute, that to convene different stakeholder thinkers on both sides to really to develop what are the principles would look like acceptable outcome for U.S. and China and the other countries. What a path would look like, what are the principles would look like, and then results in pretty ambitious outcome in the international agreement, the Paris Agreement, where the first time that China commit to a timing of carbon emission peaking. Again, it's not to say that the Paris Agreement is perfect, but then it's a breakthrough without a doubt. It was the first time that would break the dynamic, and showcase that maybe the bottom-up action could work. And then times passed, and then personally, I relocated from China. I was working in China between 2005, 2015, and then relocated to the U.S. After 2016. And of course, the Trump administration that there's no very serious high-level political engagement on climate change. There's still some momentum and some initiative going on with the working level of government. There's dozen workshops, exchanges. What's going on? It's there, although that is nothing of a high profile, nothing that game changing. That said, I think that on practitioner level, both U.S. and China, they actually actively keep the dialogue live, right? So they make sure that each other that they will understand what momentum are. And initiative in the U.S., like we are still in the U.S. Climate Alliance and the climate mayors, that kind of initiative send a very clear signal. Although the federal government in the U.S. are not taking the action at the time, there's a huge momentum from the national and from corporate sector that's still going on. So it actually strengthened the China's confidence that this is something to go. And at the same time, I think there's something transformational changing after in the last 5 or 8 years. That I think this final understanding, realization that climate change is actually not at the expense of development. Mitigation climate change actually is good for the economy. It's a new way to develop, given that China is its own dilemma for the economy. So this kind of this development actually was getting a lot of feedback, a lot of evidence from because the China's leadership see a lot of progress and coming from the leading U.S. companies, both and that actually providing the one of the feedback. I cannot say that is the determining feedback, but that one of the evidence that this actually is doable. And then finally we come to this time that carbon neutrality announcement last September. And then, that's where we are now. So I would see that going forward, of course, in the three political dimensions, that it's very important to have the senior political leadership engagement, head of state level engagement, build the trust there. On the working level or senior / working level, I think there's a lot of good foundation trust building there. We mentioned earlier that His Excellency Xie Zhenhua is reappointed as the climate envoy for China, and then Kerry is now representing U.S. again. So there's a lot of goodwill and trust between these leaders. Although that is not U.S. official, but then Bloomberg, as a U.S. national, was appointed as a UN climate envoy. So that actually created a lot of space, political space, and a personal trust that will actually enable fostering a better dialogue and cooperation. That being said, understanding things are a bit different than in the Obama year. I would not be naive to say that it's all go back to old style, cooperation. And as China understanding this is not something that was pushed by the US, they want to pursue itself. I think more and more increasingly, that will be very helpful cooperation, but there also will be some competitions. Hopefully a constructive one, where the countries will ignite that this is a race for new economy, race for new economic development engine, rather than I'm pushed to take my burden, take on the share. So that is what I think that there's a lot of agreement can be agreed upon. There's a discussion on cooperation between US and China on CO2 implications, the hydrogen road policy roadmap, green recovery, what it looks like, and then very important if there's some kind of for constructive competition to take place, some kind of common understanding and common rules need to be in place, including both countries, our investments or development for different countries, what kind of development would look like, and therefore paving the a level ground field for the companies of different countries to actually to compete in low carbon manner. That would be a hopeful way to go forward. So to conclude my remark, that I actually read this morning about op-ed in New York Times, just describing how President Biden navigating the U.S. climate policies were characterized as dialing down the conflict, but then dialing down the policy. I think that the same spirit we're applying here. Dialing down the conflict, meaning that dialing down the rhetorics and then the sense of tension between the two countries, but not at the expense of lowering expectation, lowering their ask. We could use less rhetoric, less conflict in public, but then make sure that the policies stand up. Because only then I think the public can make. And then I think with what China is now, politically understanding this what it's about, I do think there's a real possibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Renping. That's a wonderful add up to the policy point from a practitioner. And thank you for sharing with your experience on working on a lot of projects, whether, as you highlight, whether it's competitive in nature or cooperative in nature. So there's a lot of experience and lesson learned. So I would like to open this for a Q&A. We have about 25 minutes before we close up. Let me read some question in our Q&A. And the first question is from a gentleman in Ottawa. So what effect will US policy on climate change have on climate change in general? What is the cost of the policy and what would be the benefit on global climate? I think that's the question is didn't mention to whom is addressed. Welcome to make a comment. And the following question from the same audience. In 2020, China's coal power capacity under development or construction is about 200 GW, which is more than the US entire capacity. So will US policy have any significant effect on global climate? So who want to go first? So the question basically is about what is the cost and what is the benefit reading Biden's climate change policy.
So I think I can jump in to start. I think there are two things we need to think about when thinking about the effect of increased US action to address climate change. I think the first is really just how stringent the actions will be, or how much carrot or how much stick there will be to change behavior by consumers and firms. And that determines the overall effect on global emissions. up until now, we've had fairly incremental progress, and it really depends on how aggressive the US wants to be. And I think the second part of that is whether or not increased ambition in US climate policies has a role in terms of moral suasion on the actions of other countries. And yeah, I mentioned the collective action problem in my opening remarks. So if the Biden administration being aggressive and looking for cooperation and collaboration with other governments is the way to push action forward, that could have a significant impact above and beyond the actions within the US. And then I guess on the cost issue, of course, there's going to be a cost to changing our energy systems, our energy use. We're really, we're front loading costs and we're back loading benefits. But I guess, we have this short-term pain, but the relevant comparison is what happens if we do nothing. And for that, we're looking at a lot of long-term pain for short-term benefit.
Thanks, Jennifer. Anyone want to add on it? Otherwise, I'm going to move to other questions. We have a series coming up. Sally.
Yeah, I think, we're seeing the marketplace start to move in areas anyway. And so by bolstering the marketplace, whether it's through infrastructure and grid or supporting solar, wind, renewable, I mentioned the electric vehicles, the US is moving, China is moving, Canada is moving, we're all sort of moving in that direction. And I think the marketplace with a little support from all of our governments is really going to push this, and it's going to be aggressive, and it's going to be transformational, not just in the US economy, but the global economy. And so the loss of jobs, as I said earlier, there really has been a lot of work done on that by economists, and it's a one-to-one really, and it's going to be expanding to be more jobs in the long run in the new renewable and energy efficiency type jobs. And they're clean jobs, they're good paying jobs, they're technical jobs. They don't have the environmental unfortunate negatives that say, coal, some of the other carbon, pollution does. So I think it's a win-win all around, and it's got to be aggressive, and it's got to be now, and it's going to happen.
So I would also like to add upon coal-fired power generation in China. This is one of the most stickiest issue regarding China's climate ambition in the past. In 2019, actually, more than half of coal-fired power plants in China run a financial deficit, which means those plants didn't make money. But even so, there are still significantly greenfield new construction. This has become a concern, not only for the international community, actually, for decision makers in China, because if we look at what happened after President Xi Jinping's carbon neutrality pledge, then he later committed to increase non-fossil fuels share in China's energy mixture from 20% to 25% by 2030. 5% in China's energy mixture, the largest one in the entire world, is huge. So which means the renewable will receive a significant boost in the coming 10 years, which basically will stifle the additional space available for coal-fired power generations. In other words, most of those greenfield coal-fired power plants will become stranded assets in the future. So that's why currently in China, more and more central state-owned enterprise actually become very cautious in terms of greenfield coal-fired power plant construction. The problem is more in the local government level because the concern of local economic development and the local employment and the local taxation. There's still incentive to encourage a greenfield coal-fired power plant development down the road. So in the 14th five-year plan period, how the central government could balance China's short-term economic anxiety to stimulus local economic development and its long-term strategic interest to avoid stranded assets down the road. That will test the political wisdom of Chinese political leadership.
Well, thank you. And thank you, Kevin. We have a question with regard to the Arctic. So any thoughts on what the national climate policy might mean for the Arctic region and the future of Arctic governance? It's a question, I think, for Sally. You're working on a lot of issues on Arctic, IUU, whatever. You have the floor.
Well, honestly, Nong, you should probably answer this. You're the Arctic expert, but I'll give my view and perhaps you could add to it. I mean, in my view, there are really three areas when it comes to the Arctic. You know, as ice melts and the Arctic opens up, we really need to be mindful about the ecosystems. Number one, fisheries, permafrost, and the important habitat. And so we really need to develop treaties that really take the precautionary principle into account of what does climate change and what does opening up to new users mean. That's one. Similarly, the safety issue. As there are more ships, whether they're you know, bringing goods or tourism ships, as more activity, we need to get the infrastructure there to safeguard both the people on these vessels as well as ensure that if there's an oil spill or something, that we have the resources to address that. And again, that will take an international sort of global group to do that. And then obviously the last piece is the security issues, the security implications as more bases get built in a warmer climate there. We just need to be mindful of the international security issues around that. So it's all global, it's all international, and it's all treaties that we need to come together with the big precautionary principle overarching.
Thank you, Sally. I'm not going to steal the time from our speakers. So Jennifer, you have two questions. One is, with the U.S. attempting to regain its leadership role in North American efforts to mitigate climate change, where do you see Canada's role in this changing relationship? And the second question is from a researcher at the China Institute, University of Alberta. As both the U.S. and China, I'm not quite sure. This is for, okay, let me read this question and then we'll see to whom this question is addressed to. As both US and China move their focus to clean energy, what is the impact of this shift of focus on the economy of Alberta? Yes, to you. How can we make Alberta great again?
Okay, so I'll start with Canada's role and in its relationship with the US. I think what's interesting now is that the US no longer is an excuse for inaction by Canada or even incremental action, right? We're seeing an obvious desire by the Biden administration to take lots of action on climate change, and so it's no longer a reasonable excuse in Canada to say it's like, oh, you know, we're so good, we're doing this stuff despite the US's inaction or limited action in the US, so we will just wait for the US to catch up. I think it's really going to be a push for Canada at the federal level and at the provincial at provincial and territorial levels to recognize that if there isn't concerted and coordinated action and policy alignment with the US, Canada risks being left behind. And sort of in the there's concern right now of the competitiveness of traditional industries as things change. I think there's going to be significant concern about the competitiveness of the changing economies within Canada. And then the impact of the change in energy on Alberta's economy. I think I'll take this moment to address Keystone XL. Because that's also part of the Canada-US relationship. And, Keystone is one project, and actually a fairly small project when you think about the size of the Canada-US trade relationship. It's just one piece of transportation infrastructure. Yes, it has disproportionate interest in Alberta, and I think it also had a disproportionate role in discussions on Canada-US trade relationships because, as President Obama said, it became a lightning rod for discussion around climate change. But the reality is that it is just one project, and I don't know if anyone was really surprised when President Biden canceled the permits on his first day. I mean, it was something he said all along that he was planning to do, and really he was like, okay, he fulfills his promises. Good, like let's move on and stop focusing on specific pieces of infrastructure. More broadly for Alberta, regardless of what the U.S. does, it's clear that the world is going through an immense repositioning in terms of what energy sources we're going to use and how we're going to use them, and that is just it means that Alberta's economy has to change. I don't think we know where it's going yet, but we people here know that there needs to be change, and there will be change. And like all changes, there are opportunities. There are winners and losers, but responsible governments are thinking about building back better from COVID, and as well as just embracing change.
Thank you, Jennifer. I think the next question is to Jinping and Kevin. It's a long question. Let me summarize. So basically, Chinese President Xi Jinping in September 2020, in his speech to the UN General Assembly, announced that China will scale up its nationally determined contribution on climate change. So the question is, China has come under some criticisms for its climate impact in developing countries, where it continues to ramp up the construction of new hundreds coal-fired power plants. How, in your assessment, can China ensure that it fulfills not only its national determined contribution at home, but also does not cause greenhouse gas emission in developing countries abroad? Let me add to this question from with regard to China's BRI. I think Biden's press to prioritize fighting climate change can turn about the pressure on China's BRI, because it has been criticizing for financing and building some infrastructure projects that could harm the environment. So this is a question for Jinping and Kevin.
Sure. Let me just try to first step. So I think that the broad agreement is there, even within Chinese government, that they have to be a green BRI. This is from President Xi himself have make this commitment a couple of years ago, and then notingly that this has not been fully operationalized. But then we see a lot of progress, in the last couple of months, just like December, the first time that the official from Ministry of Environment publicly entertained the idea of putting coal power plants in their discouraged list, basically, blocking the new coal power plants investment in outside of China. Although that is not official position of policy, but it's the first time that this kind of signal was being sent. And then there's also, as far as I know, the multiple initiatives underway within China to develop all kinds of regulation instruments, incentive to make sure that the overseas investment is becoming greener and greener. From from regulations targeting the finance sector, bank to doing stress, environment stress assessment, stress tests on the finance loans, targeting the to hiking the export credit insurance price for coal-related projects, to outright target on green products and projects for SOE, state-owned enterprises, which is dominating China's our investment as we speak. Which will come from the State Assets Provision Commission, which is act as a shareholder, equity owner on behalf of the state. So there's multiple things in the making, and of course it's a battle that's continuing. But then I see a lot of problems inside, and I think that there's a common understanding. There's a political political agenda that actually make it there. So that create a lot of space for such a discussion and advocacies. And then I believe that US will become a positive force here. Stepping back a little bit, why this is happening? End of the day, that the BRI initiative it was trying to make sure that it's actually a good and positive sign to the US, to China economy. And then when we talk about China's economy, we're alluding to the earlier question about the huge amount of coal power plants being added to the system. That that's why I'm nodding when Jennifer speak. Like in Canadian context, China is such a complex issues that there's you have the top leaders speak out, and there's a very forceful agenda doesn't automatically translate to actions as national and then economy. What encouraged me is I am seeing that the SOEs and the industry enterprises actually taking the bold action to do something there. If you look at the latest news on the SOEs, that many of them, the steel manufacturers, the petrochemical industry, they all set up very bold targets for go carbon neutral, 2060, 2050, and also not to ignore that there, another giant in the playing field, the European Union, that they tangle this idea about carbon adjustment tax. Basically is a carbon tax, right? If you were to export to the EU, that you have to subject to that. And then one part is that it could be automobile. And then China, although it's not a big exporter of automobile per se to the EU, it's actually a big player in automobile parts, which that steel is a big part of it. So I'm already hearing a story that many automobile parts manufacturers asking steel makers that to create a steel lines only to supply to them, that make sure that their steel is carbon free. So this will only amplify and replicate over time. And then once they have this kind of capacity, and I would see that the only way that once China actually gain that fully confidence that they can do this at scale, not only for one production line, but then to the economy, that this will also translate into investment overseas. So that's a source of optimism for me.
So I would like to add a few bullets following Wang Ping's comment. First, if we look at the nature of Chinese overseas investment along Belt and Road countries, it's not only the problem caused by China, it's also the problem caused by the host countries. So if we recognize this fact, then this leads to the second bullet I would like to raise. There is a huge infrastructure investment deficit in those Belt and Road countries. China alone cannot meet all the deficit. So, which means the OECD countries, including US and European unions, need to step up its financial assistance in this regard to help provide green infrastructure investment along this country. The third issue is I sincerely believe in this area there's urgent need for constructive dialogue and engagement in order to move China's energy investment along Belt and Road country towards a greener and low carbon direction. Currently, we can witness both some negative sign and also positive one. Positive one, if we carefully look at the stats, actually, Chinese investment on the renewable projects also is on the rising trend. However, the magnitude of the coal-fired power plants and also other fossil fuel projects cannot be simply ignored. Having said that, if both U.S. and EU and other OECD countries could help to provide some alternative green infrastructure investment alternative to those host countries, this could make the situation better. In addition, only through engagement and constructive dialogue, instead of finger pointing, then there might be some politically palatable value to allow both the host country, China, and the concerned international community, especially OECD countries, to find a way to resolve these very challenging issues in the future.
Thank you, Kevin. Oh,
Can I just add a little bit to that? I really agree with what Kevin just said. You know, it is the responsibility of all these global leaders to really help in the development and do it in a green infrastructure and investment manner. And, you know, the green BRA is laudable. You know, one sort of out there thought is that as governments pledge to reduce carbon at home to meet their Paris Agreement targets, that if they're investing overseas and their investments result in increases in carbon, that should be accounted not in the state country where the investment is occurring, but in the investing country. I mean, if the U.S., China, Canada, or whomever invests overseas and the investments result in increases in carbon, then the investing countries should be responsible. I know it'll be difficult to figure out that accounting, but I think it's an area we need to move in.
well, thank you, Sally. Thank you very much. And we do have a couple questions remaining to be answered, but we are running out of time. So I'm going to take this opportunity to thanks to our four speakers for sharing with us your views on what the U.S. climate change policy means for China, for Canada, and for either the bilateral or trilateral relations, and also on the global cooperations in this on these very significant issues. So, I'm not intending to give a final remark. I think basically the world needs a common effort in order to minimize and mitigate the damage of global warming, and to do it quickly, and especially considering the monument that has been lost because of a pandemic. So I'm going to give the floor back to Jia.
Thank you, No. I would just like to say a final word of thanks to all our panelists, and also, of course, for our fabulous moderator, Nong, for sharing your insights for this fascinating discussion. And also, I'd like to extend my thanks to colleagues at ICAS and the China Institute for organizing this web seminar. And also, finally, a big thanks to all the audience members for taking the time to attend this event. Please stay tuned for more events we're planning in the coming month, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.